Assalamu alaikum viewers, a very warm welcome to all of you watching Hidayat TV. I'm Haider with another episode of Generation Gap. Viewers, on December 17th, 2010, a young Tunisian street vendor called Mohamed Bouazi set himself on fire in hopelessness and to protest his treatment at the hands of the authorities. Protests erupted across Middle East and they followed in Tunisia, Egypt, Libya and Yemen. Civil uprisings erupted across all this region and soon the bloodshed engulfed Bahrain and Syria too. The conflict in Syria began as a series of this major pro-reform demonstration in key cities in early 2011. And since then it's been 2 years, more than 100,000 people have been killed so far and the conflict is ongoing. There are four very recent developments which I want to share and want to start the program with. In May 2013, there was an attack committed by the armed terrorist groups on the shrine of companion of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, Haider bin Adi, in the Damascus countryside. In June 2013, a shocking and gruesome video appeared online, and a rebel soldier called Abu Sakar, a 27-year-old Syrian rebel soldier, cut out the heart of a fallen soldier and ate it before a cheering crowd in the name of Allah. It was disturbing, most appalling and gruesome video, and one must abhor these actions. Muhammad Qatar's mother still wanders on the streets of Aleppo. His son, who was only 14, was killed in the name of blasphemy when he decided not to offer a cup of coffee to one of the buyers. Strategic town of Qusair captured on June 5th by Syrian army with the help of Hezbollah and so-called Iranian help. So these four strategic points I want to start with, and to discuss all this we do have Irtaza Jafri in our studio. Irtaza is a 19-year-old. Assalamu alaikum Irtaza. Thank you very much for joining us. Hala Diab is an award-winning Syrian writer, filmmaker. She is on the phone. Assalamu alaikum Hala, can you hear us? I think we lost connections. And also on Skype, we are joined from Lahore. Raza Naeem, he's an Arabic-speaking Pakistani social scientist. He has studied at the University of Leeds and also University of Arkansas. In Middle Eastern history, also he has traveled widely in Egypt, Yemen and Turkey over the years, interviewing a large number of activists. And currently he's writing a book post-Yemen. He writes also for The Guardian and monthly newsline Karachi and Daily Times Lahore. Assalamu alaikum, Raza.
Wa alaikum salam.
Thank you very much for joining us. Raza, give us your view. What is your understanding of the conflict? Let's start with you.
Well, my basic understanding is that, as you mentioned at the beginning of the program, just like across the Arab world, there was a popular uprising in Syria in early 2011, and it took force, and there were signs that the Baath Party leadership were responding to those protests. Initially they did not respond, but there were signs that they were going to, and they even held elections. But I think the whole tenor of the conflict changed. The whole tenor of the uprising in Syria changed when the rebels decided to openly ask for help from the United States. And prior to that, already Western PSYOPs, French, the Turks, Turkey already has a listening post near Incirlik. They have United States has a base near Incirlik in Turkey on the Syrian-Turkish border. So Turkey and Qatar began to pour men and weapons and cash into massive quantities to these rebels. And unfortunately, 2 years on, the whole character of what we would have called the Arab Spring or the Syrian Spring has now totally changed, and many people are using the term civil war, but I will not use that expression. But the thing is that it's a very lopsided conflict, and the price is actually being paid by the ordinary people of Syria. And of course, you mentioned the issue of blasphemy. The minorities are increasingly being targeted. So women, minorities, and the ordinary people. A lot of sectarianism and bloodshed. Has been going
let
on
me bring in
since
Hala from Leicester. Hala, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
Thank you very much for joining us, Hala. You've been on Western media outlets and been quite outspoken about the atrocities within Syria, and because you're born Syrian. So tell us, what is your understanding of the conflict?
The beginning of the uprising in Syria, it was just peaceful demonstrations by some Syrian people who called for reform, political reform in Syria. And soon this has been hijacked by other parties, mainly the conflicting powers outside Syria, mainly Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and also by other Islamists who tried to create out of this peaceful demonstrations sectarianism inside Syria. And as we know, Qatar and Saudi Arabia is trying to empower the Salafi Sunni presence in the region, and in order to affect the power of Shia presence in the region, mainly in Lebanon and also in Iran and in Syria. And as we know, Syria is ruled by a minority group, which is Shia offshore, and it's also surrounded by Iraq, which has a Shia majority, Iran, which has Shia majority, and also Lebanon. So what's happening in Syria is a proxy of international conflict in the region between Shia and Sunni presence. And at the same time, Syrian people are paying the price for that. We never had sectarian divisions inside Syria. I came up from a very diverse family, Shia, Sunni, from different backgrounds, and we never had such divisions inside our community.
So it's a very diverse country in terms of, you can't compare it with Libya or Egypt, because that's the narrative used.
Because Egypt is more, the majority of Egyptians are Sunni, and we have some Coptic minority. In Libya also they are Sunni majority, and also the regime in Egypt and in Libya is so different from the regime in Syria. I mean, within the last 10 years, the last decade in Syria, there was a rise of political reform in Syria. However, what happened, the atrocity of the regime recently has changed the situation and caused a lot of anger of Syrians against the regime.
So what is your understanding that who is arming who? There's Iran, Hezbollah, and Russia on one side, and also all the West and the Gulf states on the other side. I mean, why this beautiful country has become a battlefield for this proxy war?
Because they are worried that Syria will empower the Shia presence in the region because of the majority of Shia around Syria, I mean here Iraq, Iran, and Lebanon, and because Saudi Arabia wants to continue and sustain the survival of the Salafi Sunni. As you know, Saudi Arabia as a country, as a government, it bases its survival on the survival of Wahhabism. And any fall of Wahhabism and Salafism and Islamism in the region means the fall of Saudi Arabia. And that's why arms have been sent and leaked through Turkey to Syria. And also Turkey itself as an Islamic state which tries to revive the Islamic power in the Middle East, and also the Islamic Khalifa in the Middle East, has also sent arms to Syria. And we know that through Libya, the jihadis, the Salafi Sunni jihadis have been linked to Syria. And that's what escalates the conflict in Syria. We as Syrians are very moderate civic people. Even we have the rise of Sufism. We're very spiritual in our relationship with God, and we are very moderate in our relation with Islam. However, this extreme rise of Salafism was a result of the exporting of jihad, tourism to Syria during the crisis.
Okay, tell me, I mean, we want to move forward. Do you think this conflict is resonating within the Europe? I mean, there are so many Western fighters present now. There are approximately 2,000 fighters who are fighting against Assad's regime. And there are people like Anjem Chaudhry who have openly supporting al-Nusra, and al-Nusra has pledged its allegiance to Al-Qaeda. So how do you connect all this?
As you know, that these jihadis who go to Syria, they're not fighting on the basis they want to liberate Syria and help Syrians for democratic civil society. They are fighting in Syria because Bashar Assad is an Alawite, and they are waging a war against Shia presence in Syria. Post-September 11, with this war on terror, a lot of defensive mainstream Islam appeared, with the rise of many Islamist scholars who call for extreme Islam in a way, as a way to defend Islam. And we see a lot of scholars who become like an icon for a lot of Muslim youth. And that actually, these scholars have been a platform for many political regimes to legalize jihad in Syria. In 7th of June in Egypt, Mursi has called scholars like Al-Qaradawi and Al-Arifi, who are Sunni Salafi, to come to Egypt and call for jihad against Iran, against the Shia, not against injustice, not against atrocities, not calling for democracy. They are fighting to establish the Islamic Khalifa against their Muslim brothers who have different sects.
But Dr. Hala, you know, I mean, Dr. Hala, let me interrupt you here. Sheikh Mohammed Al-Arafi, a professor at King Saud University, he was a star speaker a few days earlier in UK, and it is the same Sheikh who has issued fatwas for all the women to go and offer their bodies, I have to say this on this forum, to the jihadis.
For jihad in Syria, and he was allowed to come to UK and to produce a talk show here in UK for an international Saudi channel back in Saudi Arabia. He was allowed by the government to come here, and he was
that's my question. That's my question. That's my question, Doctor. That is my question, that why we are unable to portray other narrative to all these outlets and portray ourselves and the true Muslims, and we should understand that the relationship between God and one person should be not dictated by anyone. Why we are unable to do that?
Our Islamic education is so much based on what these mullah and scholars and Islamist muftis are exporting to the Muslim youth. It's not a relationship between you and Allah where you start to understand Islam, and it's not like a developmental journey of discovering Islam. And I do put the responsibility of what happened in September 11, of what happened in 7th July, of what happened in Welsh Act a few weeks ago, of what happened in Syria, on the shoulder of this extreme scholars and muftis who provoke sectarianism in Muslim world, who use Islam for their political agenda. The fall of Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt and Ikhwan is a big example of the failure of using Islam as a political ideology to rule people, and also to show that the new world, the modern Middle East, the modern Syria, the modern Egypt, is a democratic civil society for everyone, for the Shia, for the Alawite, for the Sunni, for the Christians, for the Muslims. That's the only way we will become better citizens,
do you see this happening?
And better even Muslims.
Do you see this happening, Dr. Hala?
Citizenship, not individualism on the basis of religion.
No, I said, do you see this happening? A democratic, a civic state, a Syrian state where all are inclusive and everyone is given their rights?
Work with the Syrian people, with the Syrian youth and Syrian organization in order to stress the importance of Geneva II as a way to solve the problem, and also to drain off the sources of arms going to Syria, whether from the West or whether from Russia and the Gulf area. So we will oblige both parties to negotiate, because I do believe that if you wanted to create political change through violence, violence will always be the medium for change. We need to educate Syrians how to solve their problems by engaging political solution. We need to engage Syrian government.
You mentioned Geneva II, and I want to raise this here, that there is no unified opposition in Syria. There are...
It's the main failure part of the revolution, what so-called revolution in Syria, because they're not united. The military opposition is not communicating with political opposition. There is a gap between opposition and between people on the ground, and there is no validity of this. There is no so-called opposition in Syria, and now it is the time to empower political opposition from the Syrian youth, intellectual people who want to build the new Syria. Not by arms, not by force, and not by the guns, but also by dialogue and by engagement, even with people who are different from us.
Okay, and last question before you go, because obviously you have other commitments. What is your practical solution that who will take this lead to take all parties forward? I mean, West we can't trust. Hezbollah, they are already involved in the battle, and Iran and Russia, they've been alleged to be involved. That who will take the lead? Syrian people, I don't see them represented anywhere.
I think that there should be more work here in the West with the Syrian organization and Syrian people who are not politically involved as such in the opposition, but they are part of the civil society movement in Syria, working on a peace delegation to go to Syria, Iran, Lebanon, and Russia in order to see what are the demands of the Syrian government, what are the demands of the opposition, the military opposition, even those people who are fighting on the ground, and try to draw an agreement between these people before Geneva II. So in Geneva II, these people have to sign on an agreement on ceasefire first. And then they need to know, do they want, and what are the compromises in order to find a shared ground for negotiation between the parties. And this is the responsibility of every Syrian who loves Syria to do that. It's not a responsibility for organization or an opposition or a political party. It is the responsibility of every Syrian who really loves his country or her country.
Okay, I mean, another question just came to me. Do you see Syria being another hotbed for jihadi terrorists in the Middle East in the coming months?
There is a big risk and there is a big danger, and even Mr. William Hague yesterday in one of his talks, he said that there is a big danger that Syria will be a hub for terrorism in the region, and that's why we need to, in order to minimize that, we need to engage the political dialogue between the conflicting parties and close the borders. And ask Libya, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia to get their jihadist group out of Syria. That is the only way to save Syria. I see Syria a potential also for a new birth of democracy. But the main fear, if we don't act on political solutions, Syria can be really a hub for spreading terrorism, extremism, Salafism in the region, and even to the whole world.
Okay, thank you very much, Hala Diab, founder of Liberty Media Productions and a PhD from University of Leicester, for joining us. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
This is your initial remarks. Do you understand the conflict?
Of course, it started off as the Arab Spring. It started off as people being upset or angry with their government, and they wanted change. And the change would not come unless they started to speak up. And they did start to speak up. They tried to replicate what was going on in Tunisia, everywhere else, in Egypt. Egypt is the perfect example for them to use. But as we've seen in the recent few days, what has happened with...
So do you even see that Middle East is ready for democracy? Because there were 13 million people who voted for Morsi a year ago and 22 million who signed a petition to ask him to leave.
I think the question is, are we ready for democracy in the West? Because if we look at our own governments in the UK, we've got the Conservative government with David Cameron now saying that he wants to arm the rebels over in Syria. Now that's undemocratic in every aspect of democracy. We haven't voted for it. The members in the House haven't voted for it, yet he
spends... But these are the discretionary powers, Prime
Yes,
Minister
but
enjoys.
still, but is this not, is the power, this is almost going to war. This is just cutting out, this is essentially being the arms dealer. Which in many places is considered illegal. But if we mirror this in Syria, where the fact of the matter is, from internal revolution, it has now become an international war.
And everyone
is involved. This is not
where is going to lead?
Right now, leading to total destruction of Syria.
There are 100,000 people have been killed.
That is what I can see. This is what I see. This is not what is happening from Egypt coming into Lebanon, wherever you want. No, this is Syria and Syria alone. This has now become a Salafi, Wahhabi war against those who are not, which unfortunately is
happen to be Shias, all the moderate Muslims.
The moderate Muslims, even the Christians. They've not left anybody alone.
Okay, Raza, do you agree with this notion that it has become a more sectarian-focused war, international war?
Well, it depends upon what sides you are talking about. I mean, in the mainstream commentary, I've heard many people say that it has become sectarian because the Iranians and Hezbollah are part of that. I think I disagree with this particular notion, because if you look at the role of Saudi Arabia, wherever they have gone, the conflict has attained sectarian overtones. If you look at their intervention in Bahrain, it wasn't sectarian before the Saudis intervened. The slogans of the Bahraini opposition were no Sunni, no Shia, we are Bahrainis. But the minute the Saudis entered the conflict, everyone started talking about Shia and Sunni.
So,
Similarly, what has happened in Yemen?
Raza, make me understand that what is so much interesting for Saudi Arabia and Qatar to be at every front. We have seen Taliban opening up an office in Qatar. We have seen Syrian National Congress building up in Qatar. Saudi's been always pulling the strings. What is it really which really, I mean, they have to look after their own country. There are 14% unemployment in Saudi Arabia. Can you hear us, Raza?
Well, it's democracy, plain and simple. They don't want. Yes, I can hear you. It's about democracy. They don't want to. They want to deny. Ever since the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia was set up in 1932, they want to deny democracy to their own population, and they want to deny anyone in the backyard. I mean, Saudi Arabia has always regarded Bahrain as its playground. It has always regarded Yemen as its area of influence. So, and this is not a recent thing. It goes back to the 1950s. If you look at the time when Egypt was ruled by Jamal Abdel Nasser, even in Yemen there was a vicious proxy war where the Republican forces under Nasser were helping the Republican forces in the north of Yemen, while Saudi Arabia was actually on the counter-revolutionary side. So anyone who is saying that it is only recently that the Saudis have started playing this role, I think he's living in a fool's paradise. Also, Qatar, I think it's a very small country and it is basically punching above its weight. Basically it was a kingdom, it was basically a group of Bedouins who were just given a flag by the British and said, okay, here you go, this is a country, now go and rule it. So in the case of Qatar, it is totally ununderstandable why, the Amir of Qatar, the former Amir of Qatar, for example, he's a crazy person. He has a knack of striking up unlikely alliances. But, I think these policies will actually come back to haunt them, just like they have come to haunt the West. So, and same goes for Turkey, these policies are going to be very counterproductive in the long run, I'm afraid.
Oh, okay. All right. Bring us then Western aspect now, that why we have seen war on terror going on for the last 12, 13 years. Western media and also the think tanks, they have been portraying a narrative that they should be countering Al-Qaeda. And now we are in a situation where they are almost openly focusing on the Syrian National Congress, which is represented by almost the Al-Nusra Brigade. And almost 25% of the rebel fighters, they are from this Al-Nusra Brigade. So what is it something makes you understand anything, or?
Well, what it makes me understand is the hypocrisy of Western foreign policy and, double standards. You talked about 9/11. We have ample evidence that, the 11 or 12 Saudi hijackers who did that, they were all Saudi. But was a finger even lifted against any of those people who conducted the hijacking? Not at all. Did the West impose sanctions on Saudi Arabia? Not at all. Was there any talk of no-fly zones after 9/11 in Saudi Arabia? Not at all. But if you look at some of these countries which have oil, wherever there is oil, the West talks about no-fly zones. Just look at the destruction of Iraq. How fair is it that 1 million Iraqis are bombed to death while there is a no-fly zone over Kurds, just because the Kurds struck a deal with the West. Let's talk about Libya. Libya had oil, there was a no-fly zone there. But why no talk about no-fly zone in Yemen, which have an equally nasty dictator, Why no talk about no-fly zone in Egypt, which had a state of emergency for more than 30 years. I mean, for God's sake.
And
why there's no fly zone talk
say.
for Syria, for example? Not because it has oil, but obviously because it is a country. Yes, there is no talk of no-fly zone over Bahrain because Bahrain hosts the US Fifth Fleet, because Bahrain has oil and gas reserves, which are much prized in the West. So, and again, no talk of no-fly zones in Syria. No, sorry, why there is talk of no-fly zones in Syria? Because it's a strategic country which borders Israel, and these opportunities cannot be let go by the West. So yes, since 9/11, there is a lot of hypocrisy of Western foreign policy, a lot of double standards, and the Arab Spring was a big slap to all of these people and so-called pundits sitting in Washington that who had constantly peddled the myth that the only way to deal with the West is through dictators. That's a bunch of hogwash. But now, if you look at the shape of the Arab Spring, thanks to the West, thanks to the intervention of Turkey and Saudi Arabia and Qatar, now we have another narrative which says, okay, look at how the people treated Gaddafi, how they cut him off. Let's look at this opposition member in Syria you were mentioning earlier, who massacred and took out the heart and ate it. So this is very. I mean, for me, obviously, it's not surprising, but it's very nauseating. At least the colonialists were more honest about their intentions. I think that is what is needed. They need to be a bit more honest about why they are doing what they are doing in Syria. A lot of double standards.
And I was also surprised by the statement John Kerry made while he was in, I think it was in Turkey, that we have to focus on giving weapons to rebels, and when Iran and Russia, they are taking sides. So I'm unable to understand or unable to fathom that if Iran and Russia allegedly they are playing their parts and trying to help Assad, West is doing the same, but they are doing with the wrong people. Don't you think they need to find at least the right people to have a valid argument?
Well, the problem is that they never rely on the popular people. I mean, when it came to Iraq, they were relying on that crook Ahmad Shalabi, who was a convicted crook in the case of the Petra Bank in Jordan. The West always finds such people who become desperate, who have absolutely no roots to the societies where they are born. They always rely them. I think it used to be called the Trojan horse in classic Greek mythology, And so, we have to be honest, the West always ends up with these unsavory people who then give a further bad name to them, by coming into power. The case of Egypt is particularly interesting because the people, the government which has just been thrown out was the one Hillary Clinton herself admitted that they had been in touch with these people for the last 10 years, So these are the kinds of people, unfortunately, whom the West calls Democrats and attempts to do business with. And when they actually show their true colors, then I think then they end up giving a bad name to the West. I am not very hopeful that the West is going to. I think they're going to keep relying on such mercenaries, or proxies or whatever you want to call them. The popular forces are always going to be on the other side, and that's how empires behave. If you want to understand this behavior, you just have to go back to the days of the early British Empire, in places like India and the Middle East. This is what they're doing now.
Okay, let's bring in Irtaza. Irtaza, he is mentioning West role, and I want to talk to you about the Western jihadis. I've spoken to Dr. Hala earlier as well, that why it is so much interesting for youth in West to look at these people and these what Amin Akshwani called it, pirate of the Caribbean sort of mullahs, and go after in Syria and fight there.
It comes down to their basic teachings. It comes to their knowledge that's passed down to them by, these so-called mullahs. Now, it is filled with absolute hate, and it is 100% un-Islamic. They get told that these people, the Shia, anybody who's moderate, and the Christians, the Jews, whoever else, these are your enemies, and you must kill them. By killing them, you are guaranteed a place in heaven.
And that's about it.
Now, this logic, or this understanding, or this doctrine, this is not written anywhere. This is made up.
I can buy this if I'm living in Pakistan, in northwestern Pakistan, in Waziristan region, where there's no education, there's no knowledge. But when you are in West, studied at one of the best universities in the world, and then you still go for this.
Again, it comes down to the mentality of the individual. Now, these people, they're, you know what they are? One thing is fantastic with their words, fantastic orators, and these people, they can brainwash almost anybody. And then the blame becomes onto, well, he should have stayed away, he should know better, this and that. You can't say that, you can't blame him for falling into this trap.
Oh, you can't blame
You can't blame them.
Okay.
But for their actions, they must be blamed. We must condemn each and every one of their actions. If I draw your attention to Australia. Now, on Australia, on their news channels, they were reporting of such sectarian violence between the Shia and the Wahhabis.
Okay.
And they were actually filming on the road, and it was, I think he was either Iraqi or Irani, the Shia brother. And he was just walking past with the cameraman, and they were walking past through what was the mainly Wahhabi area, and they said something to him in Arabic. They spat on him, and then literally within 2 seconons, he had punched him across the face.
So that's exactly happened at Edgware Road.
Exactly. This was before what happened on Edgware Road. This was before then. Now that was simply replicated within the streets of London. Now, Anjem Chaudhry is still roaming free. Why is he still roaming free? He's inciting hatred.
So, I mean, when you speak to your councillors, your MPs, don't you raise these things?
We do. And we've had, in Scotland alone, we've had many of these press conferences, many gatherings to condemn such behaviours. And
what is the outcome? I mean, do you see any light coming out of all this? Because when they're supporting a propaganda or they're buying something to it, so how would you win this battle?
Well, it's not ours to win. It is for the Syrians, the actual Syrian people who are the innocent bystanders in all of this. It is theirs to win. And as they're simply innocents in this whole thing. And if they cannot win, then, well, they can't win if we look at the fact of the Western interference.
Okay, all right. We'll go for a break, and before we go to break, I just want to give you some stats here. 4 Irishmen so far killed, 17 are fighting there. This is reported by Irish Times. In a recent report, London-based think tank Quilliam Foundation estimated 1,200 to 1,500 fighters. That was December 2012. June 15th, the EU's counter-terrorism chief told the Irish Times that several EU states have become increasingly anxious about the numbers travelling, and that number is between 2,000 to 2,500. Stay with us, and when we come back, we talk more about this conflict. Thank you very much for joining us again, viewers. We are talking about Syrian conflict, and we are joined from Lahore, Reza Naim, and in studio we have Irtaza from Glasgow. Reza, let me start with you again. How do you see this overall stream of, protest going across the Middle East? I mean, we have seen Pearl Square in Shahbag Square in Bangladesh, Taksim Square and Tahrir Square. I mean, are the people, they're not happy with the regimes, or is something else which is pumping?
Well, I think it's obviously, you can certainly compare the dynamics inside the Arab countries, but Turkey is a wholly different country altogether. I mean, many people have tried to compare the Turkish protests with what has been going on in the Arab countries for the last 2 years, and I have written about this. But I mean, certainly there are some similarities. For example, yes, the people are obviously unhappy. And to a certain extent it's about liberty, equality and fraternity, but also it's about some of these neoliberal economic programs which most of the governments in the Arab world had signed with the IMF and World Bank, which made even essential items like bread very, very expensive. Similarly, the Turkish government, as someone was mentioning in your program, which is really NATO's Islamists, NATO's favorite Islamists, they also, privatize and Islamize everything. So many of these governments basically ended the subsidies which had been previously given to essential items like bread, like, like the
daily
water
items,
and
the basic necessities of the poor man.
yes, the daily item. So this is one of the, and it's a global thing, because you can see it's not just confined to the Arab countries. Certainly started in the Arab countries, but since then it has also, if you look at Greece, if you look at Portugal, if you look at Spain, also some of the main issues are, why people are protesting. But obviously, the Arab countries have had other issues like dictatorship, for example. You don't have dictators in countries like, Greece and Portugal and Spain. But yeah, one should be wary even inside the Arab countries. The relationship of people to their state, the relationship of classes to each other, the relationship of the army, the degree of penetration of the United States, it's different. So, I think all these so-called analysts of the Arab world, they have been caught by surprise before by painting the Arab countries with the same dark brush. So yes, broadly speaking, the issues are the same, and obviously Turkey is a different kettle of fish altogether. But mostly, the fact that whether the countries were ruled by dictators or they were ruled by authoritarian governments like Morsi, for example, or even Erdogan, I think they failed to present a cogent economic and social program to their populations, which could actually emancipate them from what had existed previously.
Let me try to relate it to the South American. I mean, you have written about it, about South America as well.
Yes.
They were dictators, and how do you compare that? I mean, they've been successful in Venezuela and Bolivia and all those. They have been successful autocracy there and dictatorships there as well.
Yes, what's interesting about Latin America is that it was the first continent to experience what we now call neoliberalism. I mean, certainly you're right, there were very, very vicious dictatorships ruling there in the 1960s and 70s, in Brazil, in Argentina, certainly in Bolivia, Uruguay, who crushed the mass movement. But even when the elected governments came after the end of dictatorship, they basically continued the old policies in civilian clothing. So there was a massive rebellion in most of Latin America, and the outstanding leader, obviously, it started from Venezuela, the late Hugo Chavez, who came to, obviously, he tried to mount a coup against the civilian government in '92, but failing to do that, he returned. And, so basically what has happened in Latin America and what has yet to happen in the Arab world is the presence of mass movements, mass social movements which are prepared to take power, and when they take power...
From these squares, do you see them taking their countries towards the prosperity which we are seeing, at least in Latin America, because oil-rich countries, they do share the same, at least main themes around it.
Well, I'm sorry to have to disappoint you. I wish I had a crystal ball, but in Arab world so far, yes, there exists a certain. I mean, the left historically has been weak in the Arab world. It used to be very strong in Iraq, but it was massively crushed by the Baath Party. Unfortunately, you know, when you have a vacuum, then the only parties to fill the vacuum will be the Islamist parties, and you have seen what has happened to Mursi, you know, and that was also a result of years and decades of Western backing. So unfortunately, right now, certainly there are movements like the Murud in Egypt, but they have yet to basically, I mean, there is no charter of demands, for example, beyond asking for the removal of Mubarak, beyond asking for a removal of Mursi. I mean, which distinguishes them from Latin America, because as soon as the movements in Latin America came to power, they immediately, you know, reversed most of the neoliberal programs which had been put into place.
Programs at least. So they had something to present to the people.
Yes, yes.
But in the case of Egypt, I think everyone is happy that Morsi is gone, but no one knows that what will follow.
Exactly, and even when the protests were going on against Mubarak, you know, there was no attempt to take power actually, unfortunately. Even in cities like Alexandria, you know, where the population, where the police had completely deserted the power to the civilian, to the protesters, they could have, for example, taken it over and presented a charter of demands. But unfortunately, we have yet to see that kind of a scale of social movements in the Arab world, which we have already witnessed in Latin America. And by the way, that is the reason why election after election you have people like Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro, people like you know, the Correa in Ecuador, people like Evo Morales being re-elected in election after election. So that is the proof that, you know, number one, they have produced rulers who basically deliver what they can promise to the population, and when they have done that, the population basically re-elects them and puts its faith in these politicians, and this is the reason why they have become an anathema to the United States. Okay. You know, you just have to look at.
Bring in Syria here, and let me speak to Irtaza. Do you think, taking the same argument, is the Middle Eastern population, they are politically less mature? They are not ready for these sort of democracy.
It's hard to actually define what is political maturity because of the fact that each and every single person has their own different view of what is democracy. If we look at within one political party, so many people have so many different ideas, but the fact of the matter is, it's on the core principles in which they come together. Now, if the Syrians, or not even in Syria, but everywhere, if people can come together on the foundations of what makes
what
a
exactly
country
was
great.
Referring to as charter of demands.
Yeah, yes. Absolutely, absolutely. If they can come to an agreement on them, then you can say that they've achieved what we call political maturity.
But it's at the moment.
It's everywhere. There's
disarray.
Exactly.
And what about the role of these foreign interventions in, especially Hezbollah, because I think the strategic battle which fought and won by Hezbollah and
in qusair.
In qusair, how do you see fall of qusair in the long term?
In the long term, I mean, strategically it was fantastic for the Syrian army, but the fact of the matter is, there's reports, and now we have to take these reports, but they're not. We can't say that they're the God's honest truth. You know, the media within the West or the Middle East and Asian, they're more Wahhabi funded, and therefore they have their own Wahhabi agendas, whereas the media here is pro FSA. Now, the fact of the matter is, there is no denying the Hezbollah intervention within qusair, regardless of whoever you follow. And as far as...
But Sheikh Nasrullah on 25th May, I remember watching his speech, he openly declared, with his honest intentions, let's take it for the case of argument, that he wanted to defend all the Sunnis, all the
he does.
Shias, and all the Christians.
If we look at what's happening in Lebanon,
Assad.
if what we see is happening in Lebanon, just within there, he's doing a fantastic job at that. he is there for each and every one of his citizens, and he will be there until.
So, but then the West calls him
a terrorist.
Yes.
Yet, on the other hand, they're funding the terrorists. Now, there's a double standards there. So who's a terrorist in their books? Is it?
So it's again the definition.
Exactly. What is a terrorist? I mean, they see the Sayyid there in Lebanon. He's there for his people. He's there against anyone who declares illegal war, which is what's going on in Syria. Now, therefore, he sent his own troops within the qusair region to take hold for them to
because
be able to take hold of that.
Because it was strategically important for their own relationship.
Exactly.
Okay, Raza, do you tell us about the role of Hezbollah? I mean, you might have a different perspective in this conflict.
Well, obviously, Hezbollah, I think we have to understand that they have a strategic alliance with Iran, and they have a strategic alliance with the government of Syria, and there is no surprise there. The Western countries make alliances all the time, so why shouldn't sovereign countries make alliances with each other, especially when there is an existential threat to Iran? Because I believe, and I don't think we have talked about this in this show so far, I mean, the real reason to get at Damascus is basically to get Iran, which is already under a lot of pressure right now from the so-called Western community because of its nuclear program. So yes, the Battle of Qusair obviously could not have been won by the Syrian government without any help from Hezbollah and also Iran. And let's be honest about it. They are strategic allies, and there's nothing wrong with that. Particularly if you look at the double standards of the West, they claim to be bringing democracy to all these wonderful countries, but look at the some of the outfits which they are working with, some of the most ghoulish and nasty people, to actually bring democracy. And
I want to take you back to 9/11, pre-9/11 scenario.
Yes.
That when they were invading Iraq, don't you think their own think tanks would have thought about it, that this is a crescent, as King Abdullah of Saudi Arabia, they call it, a Shia crescent across Middle East will be formed when Shia majority will be holding the government in Iraq, and obviously it will have influence and strategic alliances all across Middle East. Didn't they think it through at that time?
Well, I don't buy this. I mean, this theory is a nonsense theory which journalists have peddled, that there is a Sunni crescent and there is a Shia crescent. I don't buy that. And talking about Western think tanks, well, they always live for the present, and they basically have to justify the funding which they get, most of them which they get from the Israeli lobby. So they have different. I mean, they're not, most of the people who draft these reports are not, basically, they can't even speak the native languages of some of these countries. Just having been born in Iran or Syria or the Arab world is not sufficient qualification to make a report or a prediction. So, they don't have their pulse. Most of these think tanks don't have their pulse on what's really going on, what's been going on in that region since 9/11, and some of the politicians who actually asked them to bomb Iraq, and some of the academics also, they don't have any roots, and they don't have any idea of what is actually going on in these countries. So one can't rely on the reports and research produced by these think tanks like the RAND Corporation to, especially if you want to win the hearts and minds of the people in this part of the world.
Let me ask you this. Change of presidency in Iran and change of guards in Qatar. How would you see next year or so?
Well, Iran, obviously, I certainly don't like the regime there, and most of the people in Iran don't like the regime. But, the thing is that when the West talks aggressively about invading Iran, or that it's not going to allow Iran to develop its independent nuclear program,
then one thing it immediately does is galvanizes this population. Most of it is very young, by the way. I mean, more than 50% of the people in Iran are below the age of 35, which is a tremendous statistic. So one thing it does is it immediately galvanizes the people of Iran behind these clerics. However, the recent elections, as you know, despite the fact that this out of 400 something candidates, only this was whittled down to 7 candidates who were known more for their closeness to the regime rather than any political or social program. You know, having said that, I think the win of Hassan Rouhani is a sort of cautious, mandate towards, something, other than the usual bellicosity which has been displayed between the West and Iran.
Don't you give Iranian regime a credit for this, that be it a theocracy, but that is the only regime who is holding at least general elections for at least 30 years.
Well, certainly, if you compare Iran with the likes of Saudi Arabia, Iranians come like angels. Certainly, there is a lot of democracy in Iran, in the Iranian system of elections, even though it privileges the clerical system. But certainly, women, for example, have much more rights in Iran than they can actually. I mean, the women in Saudi Arabia are just happy to have their right to drive. That is the main demand of the women in Saudi Arabia, and even Hillary Clinton has no problem with that. And you talked about Qatar. I think one fact that needs to be mentioned is that much is being made of the fact that the Emir of Qatar, who himself took power in a coup against his own father, the former Emir, in 1994, he has stepped down voluntarily and allowed his son to take over. Well, I don't think it is going to change a lot because, again, the democracy, I call these states spectral stations, basically, because that is exactly what they mean to the West. The West, doesn't see these people as having democracy or as having their people having any sort of democratic. So it primarily deals with these people through their emirs. So frankly speaking, I don't see any major change in the crazy foreign policy. Even Al Jazeera, which is based in Qatar, is no longer the same after the departure of Wada Khanfar. So, compared to Iran, Qatar really does not offer a very hopeful prospect at the moment.
I just want to get to the end of this, that you have obviously written and you're writing a book on history of Yemen post. Do you see this happening in Bahrain as well, or it is just...
Bahrain, unfortunately, Bahrain and Yemen are two countries which have totally vanished from the map of the world media. There is no reporting on these countries, and with good reason, because both Bahrain and Yemen are on the periphery of the Saudi border. So Yemen also, I was in Yemen in 2000 and 2 years ago, after they were increasing reports that Al Qaeda was going to take over Yemen, which is a bunch of nonsense basically. Even the likes of Thomas Friedman now believes that there is a significant presence of Al Qaeda in Yemen. And unfortunately, Yemen's problems, despite the fact that they have overthrown a particularly nasty dictator, the main problem in Yemen is that the southern part of the country, which used to be communist, their grievances are not being heard of. The northern part, basically they see the north as having taken over the south, taken over their villas, taken over their economy, and there is a sort of a national dialogue going on right now in Yemen. But basically what happened in Yemen after the departure of Saleh was that there was a referendum, and his deputy vice president basically became the president of Yemen, and he is a really mediocre person. So unfortunately, I fear that Yemen may go back to being two countries it used to be before.
Okay, last question before we sign off. Last question, Raza. What is the status of Assad? What do you think? What is the future?
Well, I think, the Baath party is the main party in Syria, has been the main party in that country for a very, very long time. So any settlement in Syria would have to involve either Bashar Assad or the Ba'ath Party. I mean, let's look at Iraq and what happened there after the de-Baathification, sectarianism returned. And Syria is the last country in the Middle East which is still a secular country. So, and I believe Bashar Assad is the legitimate president, and any attempt to topple him, obviously it will be a world war. I mean, it will not just draw in Syria, but it will draw in it will draw in Iran, it will draw in Lebanon, it will draw in Israel. So the West must really, basically, unless they want to start a world war, they should and they must try to involve
you mentioned Israel
and the Ba'ath Party in the negotiations.
You mentioned Israel. I just want to bring Israel, because we haven't discussed it. That Israel, what is the role? I mean, is Israel pulling strings at the back, or we haven't seen any media saying anything about Israel in this war?
You mean in Syria? In Syria?
Yes, obviously. I mean, I'm unable to believe that war is going on next to your border and Israel is not doing anything.
Well, it's interesting because right after Baghdad was conquered by the Western forces, Israel sent a message to the American, to George Bush, and they said, if you don't mind, can we please roll our tanks into Damascus? That would be a great way to get back to the Assad. And obviously, sanely, the Washington did not permit them to do so. I mean, let's not forget that a part of Syrian territory called the Golan Heights is still under the control of Israel. Israel is refusing to vacate it. So yes, I mean, they would not be very unhappy if the regime in Damascus falls, and obviously they would be foolish to get involved in Syria's internal wars, because Syria has a large army. It is probably the only army now which can actually challenge Israel, and obviously they don't want to involve Hezbollah in that conflict. I think what it is doing right now is very wise, because I don't think they have their own problems to deal with in Israel, like a corrupt former prime minister.
Yes, they do have their own. Okay, thank you.
I don't think it would be wise for them to get involved.
Okay, thank you very much, Raza, from Lahore, joining from Lahore, a PhD from Middle Eastern and expert. Thank you very much for joining us from Lahore. It is a lost thoughts, and I want to bring in everything. What do you see? What will be happening in 6 months' time or a year time?
Well, like Raza did say, that Assad is the legitimate leader of Syria. And it is to credit to him that the fact that he's been a leader in such conditions. Now, if we look across the pond over to to Egypt or Tunisia, the leaders crumbled under such pressure, and that was just semi-peaceful protests. This is full-out civil war, and
it's been on for 2 years.
And it's been going on for 2 years. It's non-stop. Yet
but don't you think that Assad should come to compromise, at least facilitate these protesters?
He would be willing to even hold peace talks. But these people, they're staunch haters of Assad. They're not even willing to sit in the same room to negotiate any sort of treaties or anything. So
what will happen if we take Assad out of this equation?
If we take Assad out of the equation,
it's a vacuum.
Yeah, it is a vacuum. Who comes in? Will it be military rule? Will it be a dictatorship from one of the rebels? There is no structure in place that will define who will take over.
And it's very interesting. I want to point this to viewers as well, that the Syrian Revolutionary and Opposition Forces, their Prime Minister Ghassan Hittu, he's been staying in states for years, and because he is from Syrian origin. And same goes for George Sabra, Syrian National Council, which was formed in 2011. He has been living in. So it's another Hamid Karzai going in Syria and then just taking the lead from 10-15 years.
It's exactly the same position in Pakistan right now. We've got people like Nawaz Sharif self-exiled into London.
So why can't people take the fate in their own hands and change things?
I think the fact is without meaning it too literally, they're too afraid. They're too afraid to step in because of the fact if they do one or two things wrong, they're not wanting to face the criticisms in the manner that Assad's been faced with They don't want that responsibility upon their shoulders. So they look at the people who are willing to do that.
And a 19-year-old political activist, if you've been asked to lead this negotiation, how would you deal with those parties involved? And I want you to be more inclusive with your approach rather than sweeping the rebels who were Salafis.
Absolutely.
And,
You would get each and every one of them involved. Each one of the, if you look at the FSA, they've got so many brigades, including Shia brigades, might I add. Now, if you add in each of these brigades leaders, the commanders, you bring them in, you bring in the major opposition parties such as the SNC, and then you bring in people like Bashar al-Assad. You sit them down, and then you negotiate peace treaties. And the fact that
so is it going to be a split sort of Kurdistan and then some area for rebels and some areas for Alawis?
There should not be any split in Syria. Syria is one of the most historic
and most beautiful.
Absolutely.
I mean, I've been to, obviously,
Damascus is one of the most historic cities in all of mankind. I mean, you know, Alexander the Great, you know, during the Islamic
Aleppo
time,
is one of the oldest cities, yes.
Exactly. I mean, the amount of history that one country holds, it's unreal. Now, we can't, as humans, never mind what side we take, we can't let that happen. We cannot let these people tarnish what was once there. So, there should not be any divide. There should not be any split. Obviously, you're going to find that some sides prefer so and so, and
so they have to come and negotiate.
That's the norm.
Okay, and what's your message to the viewers, youth especially, I would say, that who are watching this or who are not informative as you are?
It's very, very important that they understand the issue. Not take it by hearsay that so and so has done that. It is very crucial that you read into it. You look at all the sources, all the statistics. Then and only then can you give a valid point, a valid argument.
And I think it will resonate more.
Absolutely, absolutely. If people actually educate themselves within this issue, then and only then can people understand. I've seen people just ridiculously saying, Bashar the dog, Bashar so and so. You know, they've got leaders of the Free Syrian Army within their display pictures, and they don't understand what is going on. These people are murderers. You know, they're ripping out vital organs after they kill soldiers and then eating them. Now, you cannot say that we pledge allegiance to these people. So it is very crucial that we understand, and then we implement our own organisations, our own think tanks.
Take up the issue
within our communities, not out with,
so
not
at least
internationally.
We're not sided.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you very much, Hidayat, for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for joining us, viewers. We have talked about Syria conflict in detail today, and also the widening aspect involving countries like Yemen, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, role of Turkey, Iran, Hezbollah. And what we understand, or what I think we need to understand, is that this is a conflict which will eventually, if not handled properly, will affect all of us. So we need to understand, and we need not to take sides, but look rationally and bring out for a solution which we can take with our community leaders and approach our councillors, MPs, and all the forms we can use. With this prayers, as always, हमको न दे सिवाय गम शब्बीर का गम बांट रहा है तो इधर दे। अल्लाहुम्मा सल्ली अला मुहम्मदिन व आले मुहम्मद।